Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good evening. Today is Black Monday, the day the Dow dropped more than 500 points.
Please join me in welcoming George Soros.
It's panic. Everyone's everybody would try to find a bottom.
To stand up and do something, become really engaged in the electoral process in this country.
What we have to confront is a deep, systemic and structural restructuring of our world. And this will take some time. And the world will look differently after we have gone through this transition process.
For centuries, they've been stuffing their stomachs with human flesh, and they've been stuffing their pockets with money. But they must realize that this bowl of vampires is about to end.
We have an army of digital soldiers.
That this is coming. This is going to be a part of a future where we can take back our power in ways we didn't even think about in the industrial age that are coming in the digital age.
But the common people of these countries in their heart, they can feel what's happening. They can see our struggle for our independence, for our true sovereignty. And they see this connection with their aspirations to be truly independent, which is exacerbated by the fact that in the Western elites there is a strong desire to freeze the current unfair state of things in international affairs.
Well, let me tell you something, brother. When they took a shot at my hero, and they tried to kill the next President of the United States, enough was enough. And I said, let Trumpomania run wild, brother. Let Trumpomania rule again. Let Trumpomania make America great again.
People who don't believe are walking dead. They are asleep. And this is the awakening.
Putin has just wrapped up his address. What did we learn specifically, Guy?
Well, this wasn't exactly a speech long on de-escalation talk. President Putin made it very clear that Crimea would be joining the Russian Federation. He talked about the fact that Russia felt robbed when Crimea was handed over to the Ukraine by Khrushchev. He said that Russia felt robbed by the breakup of the Soviet Union. He talked about the fact that Crimea had effectively done what it was supposed to do and applied to join the Russian Federation. It's always been part of Russia. He talked about the fact as well that there is an absolute majority inside the Crimea that wanted to join Russia. And he said when it came to the referendum over the weekend that all diplomatic norms were observed.
17 марта в Крыму состоялся референдум.
We had a referendum which took place in the Crimea, fully consistent with all norms of international law. More than 82% of voters took place, and more than 96% of those who voted for reunification with Russia.
He talked about the fact that Crimea was an integral part of Russia. He also said, and this is interesting, that the move that Russia made effectively saved this peninsula from NATO. And I think now we're beginning to get to the heart of the concerns that President Putin has. This speech was very long on history. That really was the justification for the decision to accept Crimea into the Russian Federation, or re-accept the Crimean Peninsula into the Russian Federation. It's about NATO. It's about the long-term rivalry that exists between Moscow and NATO. And I think that's what it ultimately boils down to, Betty.
Guy, how is this playing in Russia?
Well, I think this is playing in Russia pretty well, to be honest. When you play the nationalist card, it's quite hard to argue against a series of standing ovations during that joint session of Parliament. So nationalism, quite hard to argue against. And you listen to some of the language coming out of President Putin's mouth, it was very strong. The nationalist agenda was very, very clear. But we are obviously seeing some concern about what's happening to the economy. That really is going to be a slightly longer term game. Though the fact that the ruble has been under pressure is something that the average man on the street and woman on the street in Russia will recognize very, very quickly. But at the moment, this is being seen as a win for Putin and a positive for Russia.
All right. Good evening. All right, let's try that again. Sorry about that. Microphone issues. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Book of Trump. This is chapter 46, the annexation of Crimea. So in this chapter, we're going to be covering Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. It's been a few weeks since we've been back. I apologize for that. This time slot is a little challenging with kids. This is actually a pre-recording. It's a few hours early, so not too early, but too much early, but earlier. But yeah, this is just 7:30 is a harder and harder time with the kids. So might need to find a new time slot, or might just have to start pre-recording the show. But going to do as many live shows as I can. Anyway, before we get into it, let's hear a word from our sponsor, our friends over at Tamarack Gardens. Spring has sprung at Tamarack Garden. Time for your body to bloom with pure plant powered magic. Kick off your spring glow up with their best-selling detox collection. It lovingly supports your kidneys, liver, and lymphatic system, flushing out winter junk for fresh energy, clarity, and that vibrant spring vibe. Then hit the sun safely. Their nourishing sunscreen packed with skin-loving plants and natural SPF, tinted with cocoa for instant golden glow. No white residue, just radiant you. Protect against mosquitoes and ticks the natural way with their DEET-free, plant-powered bug spray. Safe, effective family protection. The herbal lineup eases headaches, allergies, anxiety, and more. All handcrafted by a fun family in North Idaho since 2021 from local wild weeds and wildflowers. Reclaim your health one plant at a time with Tamarack Garden. Visit tamarackgarden.com and use promo code Badlands for $10 off of $50 orders. And thank you to our friends over at Tamarack. Yes, so tonight we are going to be discussing, again, the 2014 annexation of Crimea. This is a kind of like a continuation of the Maidan coup, which was the last show we did, or the last show we did on Russia. And so just to remind everybody, the Maidan coup occurred in February of 2014. And then all of a sudden at the beginning of March, soldiers appeared in Crimea and which Putin later took credit for that. There was an election on March 16th, 2014, to annex Crimea. It was overwhelmingly in favor of I'm sorry, there was a vote that was held by the Crimea that was conducted by the Russian military in order for Crimea to leave Ukraine and join Russia as its own republic. I think the final vote count was, what was it? 90. It was 83%, right? Or I'm sorry, 96 to 97% voted to join Russia. 83% voter turnout. It was immediately called illegal by Ukraine and Ukraine's allies, including the UN, the European Union, NATO. And the formal annexation occurred 2 days later on March 18th. So now what I want to do is we're probably going to spend most of the episode watching this 30-minute speech by Putin where he comes out and he explains why they did this. And I was trying to clip it down, and I was like, maybe we can just show 3 minutes here, 3 minutes there. But the more I thought about it, I mean, he just does such a good job of laying it all out, and he gives so much history. He's obviously a big history nerd, just like he did when he did the interview with Tucker. So I think it just makes sense just to play the video, and I'll stay on screen and stop it and do commentary if and where it's necessary. But hearing it in his own words, the version I have is in English overdub. There's the version I have is just a still frame of him at the podium. But then it's the English audio of the speech. Otherwise, it would be in Russian with English subtitles, and I'd be reading it. And nobody wants that. It's better to hear a Russian voice speaking hearing it in English with a Russian accent. It's a little more compelling. So we will get to that in a minute. But before we do, I want to play another video of President Obama, announcing sanctions against Russia for the annexation.
Good morning, everybody. In recent months, as the citizens of Ukraine have made their voices heard, we have been guided by a fundamental principle. The future of Ukraine must be decided by the people of Ukraine. That means Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected, and international law must be upheld. And so Russia's decision to send troops into Crimea has rightly drawn global condemnation. From the start, the United States has mobilized the international community in support of Ukraine to isolate Russia for its actions and to reassure our allies and partners. We saw this international unity again over the weekend when Russia stood alone in the UN Security Council defending its actions in Crimea. And as I told President Putin yesterday, the referendum in Crimea was a clear violation of Ukrainian constitutions and international law, and it will not be recognized by the international community. Today, I'm announcing a series of measures that will continue to increase the costs on Russia and on those responsible for what is happening in Ukraine. First, as authorized by the executive order I signed 2 weeks ago, we are imposing sanctions on specific individuals responsible for undermining the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and government of Ukraine. We're making it clear that there are consequences for their actions. Second, I have signed a new executive order that expands the scope of our sanctions. As an initial step, I'm authorizing sanctions on Russian officials, entities operating in the arms sector in Russia, and individuals who provide material support to senior officials of the Russian government. And if Russia continues to interfere in Ukraine, we stand ready to impose further sanctions. Third, we're continuing our close consultations with our European partners, who today in Brussels moved ahead with their own sanctions against Russia. Tonight, Vice President Biden departs for Europe, where he will meet with the leaders of our NATO allies, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And I'll be traveling to Europe next week. Our message will be clear. As NATO allies, we have a solemn commitment to our collective defense, and we will uphold this commitment. Fourth, we'll continue to make clear to Russia that further provocations will achieve nothing except to further isolate Russia and diminish its place in the world. The international community will continue to stand together to oppose any violations of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. And continued Russian military intervention in Ukraine will only deepen Russia's diplomatic isolation and exact a greater toll on the Russian economy. Going forward, we can calibrate our response based on whether Russia chooses to escalate or to de-escalate the situation. Now, I believe there's still a path to resolve this situation diplomatically in a way that addresses the interests of both Russia and Ukraine. That includes Russia pulling its forces in Crimea back to their bases, supporting the deployment of additional international monitors in Ukraine, and engaging in dialogue with the Ukrainian government, which has indicated its openness to pursuing constitutional reform as they move forward towards elections this spring. But throughout this process, we're going to stand firm in our unwavering support for Ukraine. As I told Prime Minister Yatsenyuk last week, the United States stands with the people of Ukraine and their right to determine their own destiny. We're going to keep working with Congress and our international partners to offer Ukraine the economic support that it needs to weather this crisis and to improve the daily lives of the Ukrainian people. And as we go forward, we'll continue to look at the range of ways we can help our Ukrainian friends achieve their universal rights and the security, prosperity, and dignity that they deserve.
All right. And, you know, listening to that, it sounds very, very similar to some of the language we've heard revolving around Iran. I mean, it's hard not to hear that and not see a lot of similarities. And again, I think that just goes to show, and I'm talking about the neocons. I'm talking about the neocons and the, you know, the Republican establishment figures who are so giddy about the current war with Iran. Interesting seeing this stuff in hindsight. But that really tees up, I think, this speech that Putin gives. And so let's just jump right into it. Let's let Putin kind of explain it in his own words. And remember, just to rehash, the Crimean, the head of the Crimean legislature, their Congress went to Moscow and asked Putin to annex Crimea. That's what happened. And then they invited the Russian military in, right? And then the Russian military established security over Crimea, held the elections, and then they annexed the peninsula. So all this was done with ostensibly with the permission and the complicity of the Crimean government, the Crimean people. And it was the West that freaked out. The unipolar hegemony freaked out and said, "You can't do that." And that's what led to, of course, the war. So let's let Putin, before we go any further, let's just let Putin get up and give you his version of events. This is a 33-minute video, so we're just gonna go ahead and start playing it, and I will just pause it if and when necessary to discuss. I'm sorry, I need to share my screen.
State Duma deputies, good afternoon. Representatives of the Republic of Crimea and Sevastopol are here among us. Citizens of Russia, residents of Crimea and Sevastopol. Dear friends, we have gathered here today in connection with an issue that is of vital historic significance to all of us. A referendum was held in Crimea on March 16th in full compliance with democratic procedures and international norms. More than 82% of the electorate took part in the vote. Over 96% of them spoke out in favor of reuniting with Russia. These numbers speak for themselves. To understand the reason behind such a choice, it is enough to know the history of Crimea and what Russia and Crimea have always meant for each other. Everything in Crimea speaks of our shared history and pride. This is the location of ancient Chersons, where Prince Vladimir was baptized. His spiritual feat of adopting orthodoxy predetermined the overall basis.
And by the way, so he's referring to the baptism of Russia. We've talked about that event so many times. It's the same event that Putin educated Tucker Carlson on, 988 AD, where Vladimir the Great, who was, I believe he was the great grandson of Rurik, the Varangian, who was the original king of the Rus, the proto-Russian nation. He was baptized in Kherson, I believe at modern-day Sevastopol, on the beaches there. And then immediately, because he lived in Kiev, that was where the center of power was. Pretty much overnight, within a week, everybody adopted Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, throughout the Russian nation. And that's why the event was referred to as the baptism of Russia.
Of the culture, civilization, and human values that unite the peoples of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The graves of Russian soldiers whose bravery brought Crimea into the Russian Empire are also in Crimea. This is also Sevastopol, a legendary city with an outstanding history, a fortress that serves as the birthplace of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Crimea is Balaklava and Kerch, Malakhov Kurgan and Sapun Ridge. Each one of these places is dear to our hearts, symbolizing Russian military glory and outstanding valor. Crimea is a unique blend of different peoples, cultures, and traditions. This makes it similar to a group has been lost over the centuries. Russians and Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and people of other ethnic groups have lived side by side in Crimea, retaining their own identity, traditions, languages, and faith. Incidentally, the total population of the Crimean Peninsula today is 2.2 million people, of whom almost 1.5 million are Russians. 350,000 are Ukrainians, who predominantly consider Russian their native language. And about 300,000 are Crimean Tatars, who, as the referendum has shown, also lean towards Russia. True, there was a time when Crimean Tatars were treated unfairly, just as a number of other peoples in the USSR. There's only one thing I can say here. Millions of people of various ethnicities suffered during those repressions, and primarily Russians. Crimean Tatars returned to their homeland. I believe we should make all the necessary political and legislative decisions to finalize the rehabilitation of Crimean Tatars, restore them in their rights, and clear their good name. We have great respect for people of all the ethnic groups living in Crimea. This is their common home, their motherland, and it would be right. I know the local population supports this, for Crimea to have 3 equal national languages, Russian, Ukrainian, and Tatar. Colleagues, in people's hearts and minds, Crimea has always been an inseparable part of Russia. This firm conviction is based on truth and justice and was passed from generation to generation, over time, under any circumstances, despite all the dramatic changes our country went.
Okay, and just to give a quick little breakdown on percentages, because he was given some numbers there, but I don't know how much of it y'all caught. According to official numbers, census data, in Crimea, we have 60% ethnic Russians, roughly about 25% ethnic Ukrainians, which is, those are the borderlanders, considered the borderlanders of Russia. And then 15%, the remaining 15% are Crimean Tatars. And the Tatars were a Mongolian Muslim group that came with the Mongols when the Mongols came in from Mongolia, and various different nations and empires over the years were Tatarian. People, I think, get that confused with the ancient civilization, like the theory of like the mud floods with Tartaria, could be related to this, could not. But the Tartars were or Tatars were a Muslim population that lives in the Ukrainian region, the northern Black Sea coast, and was part of the Golden Horde, the Mongolian Golden Horde. So that is the history there.
Through during the entire 20th century. After the revolution, the Bolsheviks, for a number of reasons, may God judge them, added large sections of the historical south of Russia to the Republic of Ukraine. This was done with no consideration for the ethnic makeup of the population. And today these areas form the southeast of Ukraine. Then, in 1954, a decision was made to transfer Crimean region to Ukraine, along with Sevastopol, despite the fact that it was a federal city. This was the personal initiative of the Communist Party head Nikita Khrushchev. What stood behind this decision of his? A desire to win the support of the Ukrainian political establishment or to atone for the mass repressions of the 1930s in Ukraine is for historians to figure out. What matters now is that this decision was made in clear violation of the constitutional norms that were in place even then. The decision was made behind the scenes. Naturally, in a totalitarian state, nobody bothered to ask the citizens of Crimea and Sevastopol. They were faced with the fact. People, of course, wondered why all of a sudden Crimea became part of Ukraine. But on the whole, and we must state this clearly, we all know it, this decision was treated as a formality of sorts because the territory was transferred within the boundaries of a single state. Back then, it was impossible to imagine that Ukraine and Russia may split up and become two separate states. However, this has happened. Unfortunately, what seemed impossible became a reality. The USSR fell apart. Things developed so swiftly that few people realized how truly dramatic those events and their consequences would be. Many people, both in Russia and in Ukraine, as well as in other republics, hoped that the Commonwealth of Independent States that was created at the time would become the new common form of statehood. They were told that there would be a single currency, a single economic space, joint armed forces. However, all this remained empty promises while the big country was gone. It was only when Crimea ended up as part of a different country that Russia realized that it was not simply robbed, it was plundered. At the same time, we have to admit that by launching the sovereignty parade, Russia itself aided in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And as this collapse was legalized, everyone forgot about Crimea and Sevastopol, the main base of the Black Sea Fleet. Millions of people went to bed in one country and awoke in different ones, overnight becoming ethnic minorities in former Union republics, while the Russian nation became one of the biggest, if not the biggest ethnic group in the world to be divided by borders. Now, many years later, I heard residents of Crimea say that back in 1991, they were handed over like a sack of potatoes. This is hard to disagree with. And what about the Russian state? What about Russia? It humbly accepted the situation. This country was going through such hard times then that realistically it was incapable of protecting its interests. However, the people could not reconcile themselves to this outrageous historical injustice. All these years, citizens and many public figures came back to this issue, saying that Crimea is historically Russian land and Sevastopol is a Russian city. Yes, we all knew this in our hearts and minds, but we had to proceed from the existing reality and build our good and neighborly relations with independent Ukraine on a new basis. Meanwhile, our relations with Ukraine, with the fraternal Ukrainian people, have always been and will remain of foremost importance for us. Today we can speak about it openly, and I would like to share with you some details of the negotiations that took place in the early 2000s. For the then president of Ukraine, Mr. Kuchma asked me to expedite the process of delimiting the Russian-Ukrainian border. At that time, the process was practically at a standstill. Russia seemed to have recognized Crimea as part of Ukraine, but there were no negotiations on delimiting the borders. Despite the complexity of the situation, I immediately issued instructions to Russian government agencies to speed up their work to document the borders, so that everyone had a clear understanding that by agreeing to delimit the border, we admitted de facto and de jure that Crimea was Ukrainian territory, thereby closing the issue. We accommodated Ukraine not only regarding Crimea, but also on such a complicated matter as the maritime boundary in the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait. What we proceeded from back then was that good relations with Ukraine matter most for us, and they should not fall hostage to deadlocked territorial disputes. However, we expected Ukraine to remain our good neighbor. We hoped that Russian citizens and Russian speakers in Ukraine, especially its southeast and Crimea, would live in a friendly, democratic, and civilized state that would protect their rights in line with the norms of international law. However, this is not how the situation developed. Time and time again, attempts were made to deprive Russians of their historical memory, even of their language, and to subject them to forced assimilation. Moreover, Russians, just as other citizens of Ukraine, are suffering from the constant political and state crisis that has been rocking the country for over 20 years. I understand why Ukrainian people wanted change. They have had enough of the authorities in power during the years of Ukraine's independence. Presidents, prime ministers, and parliamentarians changed, but their attitude to the country and its people remained the same. They milked the country, fought among themselves for power, assets, and cash flows, and did not care much about the ordinary people. They did not wonder why it was that millions of Ukrainian citizens saw no prospects at home and went to other countries to work as day laborers. I would like to stress this. It was not some Silicon Valley they fled to, but to become day laborers. Last year alone, almost 3 million people found such jobs in Russia. According to some sources, in 2013, their earnings in Russia totaled over $20 billion, which is about 12% of Ukraine's GDP. I would like to reiterate that I understand those who came out on Maidan with peaceful slogans against corruption, inefficient state management, and poverty. The right to peaceful protest, democratic procedures, and elections exist for the sole purpose of replacing the authorities that do not satisfy the people. However, those who stood behind the latest events in Ukraine had a different agenda. They were preparing yet another government takeover. They wanted to seize power and would stop short of nothing. They resorted to terror, murder, and riots. Nationalists, neo-Nazis, Russophobes, and anti-Semites executed this coup. They continue to set the tone in Ukraine to this day. The new so-called authorities began by introducing a draft law to revise the language policy, which was a direct infringement on the rights of ethnic minorities. However, they were immediately disciplined by the foreign sponsors of these so-called politicians. One has to admit that the mentors of these current authorities are smart and know well what such attempts to build a purely Ukrainian state may lead to. The draft law was set aside, but clearly reserved for the future. Hardly any mention is made of this attempt now, probably on the presumption that people have a short memory. Nevertheless, we can all clearly see the intentions of these ideological heirs of Bandera, Hitler's accomplice during World War II. It is also obvious that there is no legitimate executive authority in Ukraine now, nobody to talk to. Many government agencies have been taken over by the impostors, but they do not have any control in the country, while they themselves, and I would like to stress this, are often controlled by radicals. In some cases, you need a special permit from the militants on Maidan to meet with certain ministers of the current government. This is not a joke, this is reality. Those who opposed the coup were immediately threatened with repression. Naturally, the first in line here was Crimea, the Russian-speaking Crimea. In view of this, the residents of Crimea and Sevastopol turned to Russia for help in defending their rights and lives, in preventing the events that were unfolding and are still underway in Kiev, Donetsk, Kharkov, and other Ukrainian cities. Naturally, we could not leave this plea unheeded. We could not abandon Crimea and its residents in distress. This would have been betrayal on our part. First, we had to help create conditions so that the residents of Crimea, for the first time in history, were able to peacefully express their free will regarding their own future. However, what do we hear from our colleagues in Western Europe and North America? They say we are violating norms of international law. Firstly, it's a good thing that they at least remember that there exists such a thing as international law. Better late than never. Secondly, and most importantly, what exactly are we violating? True, the president of the Russian Federation received permission from the upper house of parliament to use the armed forces in Ukraine. However, strictly speaking, nobody has acted on this permission yet. Russia's armed forces never entered Crimea. They were there already in line with an international agreement. True, we did enhance our forces there. However, this is something I would like everyone to hear and know. We did not exceed the personnel limit of our armed forces in Crimea, which is set at 25,000 HORN, because there was no need to do so. Next, as it declared independence and decided to hold a referendum, the Supreme Council of Crimea referred to the United Nations Charter, which speaks of the right of nations to self-determination. Incidentally, I would like to remind you that when Ukraine seceded from the USSR, it did exactly the same thing, almost word for word. Ukraine used this right, yet the residents of Crimea are denied it. Why is that? Moreover, the Crimean authorities referred to the well-known Kosovo precedent, a precedent our Western colleagues created with their own hands in a very similar situation, when they agreed that the unilateral separation of Kosovo from Serbia, exactly what Crimea is doing now, was legitimate and did not require any permission from the country's central authorities.
Okay, so just if you didn't catch that, what the precedent that the Crimean government used to legitimize what they were doing, like, hey, we're leaving Ukraine. This is our choice. We held a referendum. The people voted, over 96% according to Putin, voted yes. And the precedent they used was Kosovo, because we covered that, the Kosovo War. Kosovo left Serbia, and that led to a conflict, right? But Kosovo unilaterally decided that they wanted to leave and become their own country, and Serbia refused to recognize them, and NATO and the UN sided with Kosovo. Remember? So isn't that ironic?
Went to Article 2, Chapter 1 of the United Nations Charter. The UN International Court agreed with this approach and made the following comment in its ruling of July 22nd, 2010. And I quote, "No general prohibition may be inferred from the practice of the Security Council with regard to declarations of independence. And general international law contains no prohibition on declarations of independence." Crystal clear, as they say. I do not like to resort to quotes, but in this case, I cannot help it. Here is a quote from another official document. The written statement of the United States America of April 17th, 2009, submitted to the same UN International Court in connection with the hearings on Kosovo. Again, I quote, "Declarations of independence may, and often do, violate domestic legislation. However, this does not make them violations of international law." End of quote. They wrote this, disseminated it all over the world, had everyone agree, and now they are outraged. Over what? The actions of Crimean people completely fit in with these instructions, as it were. For some reason, things that Kosovo Albanians, and we have full respect for them, were permitted to do, Russians, Ukrainians, and Crimean Tatars in Crimea are not allowed. Again, one wonders why. We keep hearing from the United States and Western Europe that Kosovo is some special case. What makes it so special in the eyes of our colleagues? It turns out that it is the fact that the conflict in Kosovo resulted in so many human casualties. Is this a legal argument? The ruling of the International Court says nothing about this. This is not even double standards. This is amazing, primitive, blunt cynicism. One should not try so crudely to make everything suit their interests, calling the same thing white today and black tomorrow. According to this logic, we have to make sure every conflict leads to human losses. I will state clearly, if the Crimean local self-defense units had not taken the situation under control, there could have been casualties as well. Fortunately, this did not happen. There was not a single armed confrontation in Crimea and no casualties. Why do you think this was so? The answer is simple. Because it is very difficult practically impossible to fight against the will of the people. Here, I would like to thank the Ukrainian military, and this is 22,000 fully armed servicemen. I would like to thank those Ukrainian service members who refrained from bloodshed and did not smear their uniforms in blood. Other thoughts come to mind in this connection. They keep talking of some Russian intervention in Crimea, some sort of aggression. This is strange to hear. I cannot recall a single case in history of an intervention without a single shot being fired and with no human casualties. Colleagues, like a mirror, the situation in Ukraine reflects what is going on and what has been happening in the world over the past several decades. After the dissolution of bipolarity on the planet, we no longer have stability. Key international institutions are not getting any stronger. On the contrary, in many cases, they are sadly degrading. Our Western partners, led by the United States of America, prefer not to be guided by international law in their practical policies, but by the rule of the gun. They have come to believe in their exclusivity and exceptionalism, that they can decide the destinies of the world, that only they can ever be right. They act as they please. Here and there, they use force against sovereign states, building coalitions based on the principle, if you are not with us, you are against us. To make this aggression look legitimate, they force the necessary resolutions from international organizations. And if for some reason this does not work, they simply ignore the UN Security Council and the UN overall. This happened in Yugoslavia. We remember 1999 very well. It was hard to believe, even seeing it with my own eyes, that at the end of the 20th century, one of Europe's capitals, Belgrade, was under missile attack for several weeks, and then came the real intervention. Was there a UN Security Council resolution on this matter, allowing for these actions? Nothing of the sort. And then they hit Afghanistan, Iraq, and frankly violated the UN Security Council resolution on Libya, when instead of imposing the so-called no-fly zone over it, they started bombing it too. There was a whole series of controlled color revolutions. Clearly, the people in those nations where these events took place were sick of tyranny and poverty, of their lack of prospects. But these feelings were taken advantage of cynically. Standards were imposed on these nations that did not in any way correspond to their way of life, traditions, or these people's cultures. As a result, instead of democracy and freedom, there was chaos, outbreaks in violence, and a series of upheavals. The Arab Spring turned into the Arab Winter. A similar situation unfolded in Ukraine. In 2004, to push the necessary candidate through at the presidential elections, they thought up some sort of third round that was not stipulated by the law. It was absurd and a mockery of the Constitution. And now, they have thrown in an organized and well-equipped army of militants. We understand what is happening. We understand that these actions were aimed against Ukraine and Russia and against Eurasian integration. And all this while Russia strived to engage in dialogue with our colleagues in the West. We are constantly proposing cooperation on all key issues. We want to strengthen our level of trust and for our relations to be equal, open, and fair. But we saw no reciprocal steps. On the contrary, they have lied to us many times, made decisions behind our backs, placed us before an accomplished fact. This happened with NATO's expansion to the east, as well as the deployment of military infrastructure at our borders. They kept telling us the same thing. Well, this does not concern you. That's easy to say. It happened with the deployment of a missile defense system. In spite of all our apprehensions, the project is working and moving forward. It happened with the endless foot-dragging in the talks on visa issues, promises of fair competition and free access to global markets. Today, we are being threatened with sanctions, but we already experienced many limitations, ones that are quite significant for us, our economy, and our nation. For example,
okay, he's about to explain some of the economic impacts that the globalists in the West had imposed on Russia, but he just ran through a lot of history there, and most of which we've covered on the show. He mentioned the Kosovo War of 1999. He mentioned Georgia, the Georgian-Russo War of 2008. We did both those episodes. He mentioned the Arab Spring. We've done that episode. There's going to be a part 2 on that because we want to talk about the Arab winter. We want to talk about the Syrian civil war. So that'll be coming up. That's all connected to this as well. But he's talking about color revolution. He's talking about when things don't go the way that these autocrats in the West want, they just ignore international law and they just do what they want. They just impose themselves. They launch color revolutions. They get violent. They start wars. And they basically do whatever they have to do to install the government that they prefer. And basically, what Crimea represented was, I think what Georgia represented in 2008 was like the realization that there is no negotiating with this thing. There is no negotiating with the blob. There's no negotiating with the unipolar hegemony. Putin realized that at that point. That's why he went into Georgia and imposed himself on the situation. The Crimea, I think, represents kind of like the first counterattack, the first counteraction. Because as he said, this is not a military operation. Like there wasn't a single bullet fired. Nobody was hurt. The military, Russia was invited in. They were asked to do this, and Crimea came willingly. So what is there to discuss? I think it's a pretty brilliant speech. We're going to listen to the rest of it. About 12 minutes left.
Still during the times of the Cold War, the US and subsequently other nations restricted a large list of technologies and equipment from being sold to the USSR, creating the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls list. Today, they have formally been eliminated, but only formally. And in reality, many limitations are still in effect. In short, we have every reason to assume that the infamous policy of containment, led in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, continues today. They are constantly trying to sweep us into a corner because we have an independent position, because we maintain it, and because we call things like they are and do not engage in hypocrisy. But there is a limit to everything. And with Ukraine, our Western partners have crossed the line, playing the bear and acting irresponsibly and unprofessionally. After all, they were fully aware that there are millions of Russians living in Ukraine and in Crimea. They must have really lacked political instinct and common sense not to foresee all the consequences of their actions. Russia found itself in a position it could not retreat from. If you compress the spring all the way to its limit, it will snap back hard. You must always remember this. Today, it is imperative to end this hysteria, to refute the rhetoric of the Cold War, and to accept the obvious fact. Russia is an independent, active participant in international affairs. Like other countries, it has its own national interests that need to be taken into account and respected. At the same time, we are grateful to all those who understood our actions in Crimea. We are grateful to the people of China, whose leaders have always considered the situation in Ukraine and Crimea taking into account the full historical and political context, and greatly appreciate India's reserve and objectivity. Today, I would like to address the people of the United States of America, the people who, since the foundation of their nation and adoption of the Declaration of Independence, have been proud to hold freedom above all else. Isn't the desire of Crimea's residents to freely choose their fate such a value? Please understand us. I believe that the Europeans, first and foremost the Germans, will also understand me. Let me remind you that in the course of political consultations on the unification of East and West Germany, at the expert, though very high level, some nations that were then and are now Germany's allies did not support the idea of unification. Our nation, however, unequivocally supported the sincere, unstoppable desire of the Germans for national unity. I am confident that you have not forgotten this, and I expect that the citizens of Germany will also support the aspiration of the Russians, of historical Russia, to restore unity. I also want to address the people of Ukraine. I sincerely want you to understand us. We do not want to harm you in any way, or to hurt your national feelings. We have always respected the territorial integrity of the Ukrainian state. Incidentally, unlike those who sacrificed Ukraine's unity for their political ambitions. They flaunt slogans about Ukraine's greatness, but they are the ones who did everything to divide the nation. Today's civil standoff is entirely on their conscience. I want you to hear me, my dear friends. Do not believe those who want you to fear Russia. shouting that other regions will follow Crimea. We do not want to divide Ukraine. We do not need that. As for Crimea, it was and remains a Russian, Ukrainian, and Crimean Tatar land. I repeat, just as it has been for centuries, it will be a home to all the peoples living there. What it will never be and do is follow in Bandera's footsteps. Crimea is our common historical legacy and a very important factor in regional stability. And this strategic territory should be part of a strong and stable sovereignty, which today can only be Russian. Otherwise, dear friends, I am addressing both Ukraine and Russia. You and we, the Russians and the Ukrainians, could lose Crimea completely. And that could happen in the near historical perspective. Please think about it. Let me note too that we have already heard declarations from Kiev about Ukraine soon joining NATO. What would this have meant for Crimea and Sevastopol in the future? It would have meant that NATO's navy would be right there in this city of Russia's military glory. And this would create not an illusory, but a perfectly real threat to the whole of southern Russia. These are things that could have become reality were it not for the choice the Crimean people made. And I want to say thank you to them for this. But let me say too that we are not opposed to cooperation with NATO, for this is certainly not the case. For all the internal processes within the organization, NATO remains a military alliance. And we are against having a military alliance making itself at home right in our backyard or in our historic territory. I simply cannot imagine that we would travel to Sevastopol to visit NATO sailors. Of course, most of them are wonderful guys, but it would be better to have them come and visit us, be our guests, rather than the other way around. Let me say quite frankly that it pains our hearts to see what is happening in Ukraine at the moment, see the people suffering and their uncertainty about how to get through today and what awaits them tomorrow. Our concerns are understandable because we are not simply close neighbors, but as I have said many times already, we are one people. Kiev is the mother of Russian cities. Ancient Rus is our common source, and we cannot live without each other. Let me say one other thing too. Millions of Russians and Russian-speaking people live in Ukraine and will continue to do so. Russia will always defend their interests using political, diplomatic, and legal means. But it should be above all in Ukraine's own interest to ensure that these people's rights and interests are fully protected. This is the guarantee of Ukraine's state stability and territorial integrity. We want to be friends with Ukraine, and we want Ukraine to be a strong, sovereign, and self-sufficient country. Ukraine is one of our biggest partners after all. We have many joint projects, and I believe in their success no matter what the current difficulties. Most importantly, we want peace and harmony to reign in Ukraine, and we are ready to work together with other countries to do everything possible to facilitate and support this. But as I said, only Ukraine's own people can put their own house in order. Residents of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, the whole of Russia admired your courage, dignity, and bravery. It was you who decided Crimea's future. We were closer than ever over these days, supporting each other. These were sincere feelings of solidarity. It is at historic turning points such as these that a nation demonstrates its maturity and strength of spirit. The Russian people showed this maturity and strength through their united support for their compatriots. Russia's foreign policy position on this matter drew its firmness from the will of millions of our people, our national unity, and the support of our country's main political and public forces. I want to thank everyone for this patriotic spirit, everyone without exception. Now, we need to continue and maintain this kind of consolidation so as to resolve the tasks our country faces on its road ahead. Obviously, we will encounter external opposition. But this is a decision that we need to make for ourselves. Are we ready to consistently defend our national interests? Or will we forever give in, retreat to who knows where? Some Western politicians are already threatening us with not just but also the prospect of increasingly serious problems on the domestic front. I would like to know what it is they have in mind exactly. Action by a fifth column, this disparate bunch of national traitors? Or are they hoping to put us in a worsening social and economic situation so as to provoke public discontent? We consider such statements irresponsible and clearly aggressive in tone, and we will respond to them accordingly. At the same time, we will never seek confrontation with our partners, whether in the East or the West, but on the contrary. We'll do everything we can to build civilized and good and neighborly relations, as one is supposed to in the modern world. Colleagues, I understand the people of Crimea, who put the question in the clearest possible terms in the referendum. Should Crimea be with Ukraine or with Russia? We can be sure in saying that the authorities in Crimea and Sevastopol, the legislative authorities, when they formulated the question, set aside group and political interests and made the people's fundamental interests alone the cornerstone of their work. The particular historic, population, political, and economic circumstances of Crimea would have made any other proposed option, however tempting it could be at the first glance, only temporary and fragile, and would have inevitably led to further worsening of the situation there, which would have had disastrous effects on people's lives. The people of Crimea thus decided to put the question in firm and uncompromising form, with no gray areas. The referendum was fair and transparent. And the people of Crimea clearly and convincingly expressed their will and stated that they want to be with Russia. Russia will also have to make a difficult decision now, taking into account the various domestic and external considerations. What do people here in Russia think? Here, like in any democratic country, people have different points of view, but I want to make the point that the absolute majority of our people clearly do support what is happening. The most recent public opinion surveys conducted here in Russia show that 95% of people think that Russia should protect the interests of Russians and members of other ethnic groups living in Crimea. 95% of our citizens. More than 83% think that Russia should do this, even if it will complicate our relations with some other countries. A total of 86% of our people see Crimea as still being Russian territory and part of our country's lands. And one particularly important figure, which corresponds exactly with the result in Crimea's referendum. Almost 92% of our people support Crimea's reunification with Russia. Thus we see that the overwhelming majority of people in Crimea and the absolute majority of the Russian Federation's people support the reunification of the Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol with Russia. Now, this is a matter for Russia's own political decision, and any decision here can be based only on the people's will, because the people is the ultimate source of all authority. Members of the Federation Council, deputies of the State Duma, citizens of Russia, residents of Crimea and Sevastopol. Today, in accordance with the people's will, I submit to the Federal Assembly a request to consider a constitutional law on the creation of two new constituent entities within the Russian Federation, the Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, and to ratify the treaty on admitting to the Russian Federation Crimea and Sevastopol, which is already ready for signing. I stand assured of your support.
All right, so a very powerful speech. Again, this was, in my opinion, this was kind of this was Putin's counter move, I think, against what NATO encroachment against, man, I hope we're not getting the lag here. NATO encroachment against Russia, because really this is just one giant conflict that you can kind of go back. You can at least go back to the 90s with it. You might even be able to go back to the Soviet Union, the Cuban Missile Crisis, World War II. But you can certainly go back to the 90s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The history there is that Crimea, for a brief time, had its own independent republic. Attempted that shortly, and then it was absorbed into Ukraine, a negotiated settlement. So it's not like Crimea has just been this like sacred part of Ukraine this whole time. It tried to be its own country, its own republic. It was then absorbed into Ukraine, and Russia trying to keep everything, trying to keep all the kids basically, right, the children in line and getting along with one another, allowed that to happen. And this was a negotiation, by the way, that the West was very much involved in. NATO was very much involved in. It had to do with pulling the nuclear weapons out of regions of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. Crimea is really important because let's pull up a map. Because we love looking at maps. So Crimea, again, is this peninsula in the northern Black Sea. And the reason it's important is because it was it was its own cognate, I think is how you say it, which is like kind of like a caliphate. Basically, it was like its own caliphate. Khanate's like an empire, a Muslim empire. Because again, they were Turkic, Mongolian. They came from They came from the Central Asian region, the steppe, and they moved across the steppe when the Golden Horde came and settled all throughout this region. But the Crimean Khanate, I believe, existed from it was the 15th century, so the 1400s, until it became part of the Soviet Union in 1917. Or I'm sorry, excuse me. No, it was annexed by Catherine the Great in the 1800s. I believe that was it 1783. So it joined the Russian Empire in 1783. So this would have been the same decade as the American Revolution. Right around the time the American Revolution was ending, the battle with Britain, Russia was fighting a war with the Ottoman Empire. Crimea was part of the Ottoman Empire, and part of the settlement was that Russia took back Crimea. So that was Catherine the Great who did that. So Catherine the Great took back Crimea. She established cities all along the northern coastline of the Black Sea. As you can see right here, Kherson, Odessa, Mykolaiv, Mariupol. I mean, these are all cities that you've heard of from the, that should be familiar from the reporting of the past, 10, 12 years, certainly since 2022. And these are all cities that were established by Catherine the Great. So, and by the way, before we go any further, let's get a word from another sponsor. And I realized that I was not showing the map, so we'll have to go back and do the map again, but that's all right. Technical difficulties. All right, Van Man. You know about Van Man taking down big toothpaste with all natural oil care, right? Van Man's tooth powder is loaded with minerals like eggshells and bone, and combined with pulling oils and peppermint aloe mouth rinse, it's truly the ultimate fluoride-free dental hygiene bundle that saves you 25% off the individual prices. And the Van never stops. Introducing Van Man's new Pearl Eye Cream and Sweet Onion Shampoo. Head over to badlandsmedia.tv/VanMan to see what's new. That's badlandsmedia.tv/VanMan. All right, we'll go ahead and hit soft disclosure as well.
Legend says, on St. Patrick's Day, a beard without oil is just a chin with ambition. But a beard with soft disclosure beard oil, that's true treasure. Spiced vanilla, naked, smooth as a leprechaun's getaway plan. Soft enough to impress your barber, bold enough to confuse a baby goat. And this boar bristle brush tames your beard like it holds the crown coin. Every bottle is American made, which means when you buy Soft Disclosure, you're supporting 6 American small businesses. That's not luck, that's capitalism with cheekbones. And while you're at it, try our mint green deodorant, because even legends need fresh pits. Soft Disclosure, go for gold. Visit softdisclosure.com and use promo code TINYBRIGHT for 15% off.
These statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. Promo codes do not apply to bundle discounts.
All right. So, again, just providing a little bit more historical context, because really what the annexation of Crimea is it's the segue between the Maidan coup, right, of February 2014 and the war in Donbass of April 2014. So the month between the Maidan coup and the war in Donbass, which will be the next episode that we're going to do. And that's where we will talk about the Azov Battalion. We will talk about the reasons why Putin had to go in. But let's just pull this map up because I just gave that whole spiel without the map, of course. So again, here's Crimea, peninsula in the northern Black Sea, strategically very important. And the Tartars were a Turkic group that came down from the steppe over here in Central Asia. They joined the Mongolian Golden Horde and formed the Khanate, the Crimean Khanate in the 15th century, the 1400s, right? And ultimately became part of the Ottoman Empire, and then fought a war with Russia in the 1780s, lost that war, and then in 1783 was annexed back to Russia, and then following the annexation and in the 1780s, that was when Catherine the Great started setting up all these cities: Odessa, Kherson, Mykolaiv, I think is how you say it, Mariupol, many of the cities that we are familiar with in the reporting. And then in May of 1783, you get the establishment of the Black Sea Fleet. And the Black Sea Fleet is historically a very significant thing. It is responsible for, under Catherine the Great, protecting the waterways, protecting international, I guess what you would call international law, but keeping the waterways clear for the new American republic at the end of the 1700s or going into the 1800s. It was the Russian Imperial Navy, and the Black Sea Fleet being a major part of that did that protected American ships, because America really didn't have much of a navy at all. And they were based out of Sevastopol, which is the city that you heard Putin cite as, I guess he said that they were going to recognize Crimea, and then they were going to recognize Sevastopol, the city of the capital of Crimea, the city in Crimea. And this guy, Sergei Aksyonov, he is the head of the Republic of Crimea. As I understand it, he's the one who went to Putin in 2013, late 2013, early 2014, and requested in Moscow that they come and annex Crimea. And then so he becomes the leader of Crimea. He's still the leader of Crimea to this day. And then all of this leads to, he didn't officially assume office until October 2014. But all of this is what leads to the war in Donbass, which, of course, just to make sure we have our geography. So here's the purple is Crimea, this area right here, the most eastern regions of Ukraine, which, of course, are the regions that we talk about when we talk about the 2022 war. Luhansk and Donetsk, those two together are what's known as the Donbass. So we're going to talk about that war, which begins in April of 2014, 1 month after this referendum and this annexation occur. We're going to talk about that next time, and that's going to be the Azov Battalion and all of that. But prior to that, March 27th, 2014, we get the UN General Assembly Resolution 68/262, and this was to impose sanctions on Russia for the annexation of Crimea. And there were a list of countries, I just thought this was interesting and worth sharing, a list of countries that did not vote in favor. They voted against, and it's only 11 at the UN out of whatever 190 some, however many there were. I think it's now 193, but however many there were in 2014, they always it changes every couple of years. A country's made, a country collapses, whatever. But 11 countries, and those 11 countries are, you can see them on the map right here: Armenia, Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, North Korea, Nicaragua, Russia, Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. Those are the countries that voted against the sanctions. And these sanctions, you heard Obama talking about it in the video at the beginning, but then you heard Putin talking about the significance of the sanctions and what they were designed to do. They were designed to hurt Russia economically, cut off trade. We then see, of course, years later, following the war in 2022, we see those sanctions get ratcheted up to the highest levels, where all banks and businesses are forced to end relationships with Russia and stop doing business with Russia. We don't get quite there yet with these sanctions in 2014, but again, one of the things we've heard Gustavo Petro, if you listen to my other shows, talk about, the current president of Colombia, is he talks about the need to get rid of OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. That's the office in the Department of Treasury that issues the sanctions, imposes the sanctions, regulates the sanctions, and is basically used as like a bludgeoning tool against foreign leaders and foreign countries that are troublesome to the desires of the unipolar hegemony, the deep state. We've seen Trump use OFAC as well, but I think he wields it in a slightly different way than the globalists have. And so Resolution 6826, we can just look at this real quick, and I do want to get out of here on time because I'm actually going to be on Culture of Change with Ash after this, so tune in for that. That will be live. Let's just look real quick at the UN General Assembly resolution. So March 27th, 2014, it was entitled "The Territorial Integrity of Ukraine." Non-binding resolution supported by 100 UN member nations affirmed the General Assembly's commitment to territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and it underscored the invalidity of the 2014 Crimean referendum. 11 nations voted against the resolution, 58 abstained, and a further 24 states were absent when the vote took place. The resolution was introduced by Canada, Costa Rica, Germany, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine. The adoption of the resolution was preceded by the unsuccessful attempts of the UN Security Council, which convened 7 sessions to address the Crimean crisis, only to face a Russian veto of draft resolution S 2014-189, sponsored by 42 countries. And so Russia's reaction on March 28th, 2014, the Russian Federation stated that the resolution was counterproductive and accused Western states of using blackmail and threats to drum up approval votes. That is really interesting. Accusing basically the deep state of being gangsters and engaging in gangster behavior to get everyone to vote yes. Worth noting that Saudi Arabia voted yes. If you look at this map right here, you got Saudi Arabia voting yes, Qatar voting yes, UAE voting or was being absent, Oman being absent, Yemen being absent, Jordan voted yes, Iraq abstained, Egypt voted, Egypt abstained, Syria was against. All right, so of course you had Assad voting against. Lebanon was absent, Israel was absent. And then a non-UN member, that would be Palestine, of course. And Iran was absent. Turkey voted in favor. So again, this map right here kind of gives you an appreciation for how much things have changed over the past 12 years, because Turkey is now a great ally of Russia, as is Iran. You can expect both of those would have voted against if that had happened today. Saudi Arabia probably would have voted against, I would assume, or at least abstained. Same with Qatar. And Egypt probably would have abstained. Probably would have abstained again. Israel being absent, I think that's probably strategic. You've heard Putin's talk about Israel and how it's basically a Russian country. It's a Russian colony because they're all Russian speaking, or a fifth of them rather are Russian or ethnic Russians. Yeah, so that is the annexation of Crimea, a relatively simple storyline. We'll get deeper into it. I don't want to get too far out ahead of our skis when it comes to the timeline, because again, we're just getting out of March here and we're getting into April, and that's when the war in Donbass begins. So rather than get too far down the rabbit hole of what happens with Crimea, because it's all kind of connected, we'll talk about the war in Donbass, because that really takes over and drives the narrative, and really takes us to the end of 2014. And then once you get to the end of the Donbass war, you're getting really close to Donald Trump announcing his candidacy, and it kind of feels like a long and winding path. We're not going to go straight there yet, because I want to circle back to the Middle East and hit Syria and hit a few things there. But next week, I will announce what the next week's show is going to be. It's not going to be the war in Donbass. We're not going to do that next. I have a surprise for y'all. But before we do that, let me tell you about GART 11, because we are headed to Nashville in a few weeks, April 9th through 12th. We are headed to Nashville for GART 11, the Great America Restoration Tour. Please go to badlandsmedia.tv/events. This is a really fun event that many of you have been to it before. Many of you have been to it virtually. Go get your tickets, your virtual tickets online, badlandsmedia.tv/events. We're going to do a virtual subscriber stream, or a exclusive live stream Thursday afternoon at 2. I'll be on that as well. So once again, badlandsmedia.tv/events, and look forward to seeing everybody there, whoever is planning on going. So next week, we're actually probably going to get out of here a few minutes early. Next week, I will be joined by Zach Payne. It is going to have to be a pre-record, unfortunately, because Zach has baseless conspiracies on Monday nights. So it's just with his 5 o'clock show and baseless conspiracies, too much for him to do a third stream in between. So we're going to pre-record it this week, but we're going to pre-record. I believe we're doing Mel Gibson. I gave him 3 options. I said, do you want to do Mel Gibson? Do you want to do JFK Jr.? Or do you want to do Michael Jackson? Honestly, I kind of want him to come on and do all 3, because I think Zach would be great at all 3 of those, but that's a big ask of Zach. So I think Mel Gibson is what we landed on, but all 3 of those are relevant characters to the storyline. And we haven't really done one of those, non-political figures or topics in a while. So I figured it made sense to, well, I guess we did had Adrian on and did the fashion show last time. But the Mel Gibson, I think, is a good one, because he is currently Trump's liaison to Hollywood, and I think he's finished working on it, but The Resurrection of the Christ, which is the highly anticipated sequel to The Passion of the Christ. I believe that's supposed to be coming out, I think, in the next year. But highly anticipated, something that Mel Gibson says he's been working on for 20-some years. And so should be a great movie, but very timely to talk about Mel Gibson and kind of his weird path and his impact on culture, because I think, we can't talk about the politics of it without talking about the culture of it. And he has obviously had a big impact on culture, and President Trump has recognized that by appointing him as liaison. So thank you everybody for being here. Please hit the thumbs up, and looking forward to being joined by Zach Payne next week. So thank you again. This is the Book of Trump, chapter 46, in the books, the annexation of Crimea. And then once we get back in the saddle on Russia, we'll do the war in Donbass, and that'll be a pretty big episode. So thank you all again, and have a great evening. I did not upload the outro video, which I think somebody said they had to get rid of it. All right.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.